Thank you for joining us, the filmmakers and Astra Taylor, for a conversation on This Is Not a Movie, a film on Robert Fisk. For more than 40 years, journalist Robert Fisk has reported on the most violent conflicts in the world. This Is Not a Movie captures him in action. In his uncompromising pursuit of the truth, Robert attracted significant controversy. In spite of danger or unpopular facts, he continued to cover stories as they unfolded, from ordinary people on the ground to Osama bin Laden. Unlike the Hollywood films that inspired his youthful ambitions, as Robert says, justice rarely prevails, villains aren't punished, and there are no tidy endings. The truth is that this is not a movie. Robert Fisk is the most famous foreign correspondent in Britain, according to the New York Times. He was a Middle East correspondent of the London Independent and has won more than 20 major British and international journalism awards. Robert passed away peacefully last October at home in Ireland. We feel extraordinarily privileged to have filmed his story in his last years, and for the opportunity we had to celebrate him and the world premiere of This Is Not a Movie together with Robert at the 2019 Toronto International Film Festival.
Thanks, Anita. And on behalf of my fellow producers, Nelfer Pazira, Igmar Trost, and executive producers Julie Goldman and Chris Clements, as well as Blue Eye Stocks and our US distributor, Kim Stim, I'd like to introduce our wonderful director, Yung Chang. Young's films include Up the Yangtze, China Heavyweight, The Fruit Hunters, and most recently, the short Pandemic 19, all incredibly engaging stories exploring complex human characters through a cinematic lens.
And I'd like to introduce our moderator in conversation with Yung tonight. Astra Taylor is a documentary filmmaker, writer, musician, and political organizer. She's the director most recently of the film What is Democracy? And the author of Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. Her previous work includes The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age, winner of a 2015 American Book Award. She has written articles for numerous publications and is the co-founder of the Debt Collective. So we were very thrilled to bring on Astra and Yung.
Hello, I'm Astra Taylor. It's really an honor to be talking to you, Yung, and to see you, if only via Zoom and not in person, at the National Film Board offices, where we would run into each other while you were making this excellent film. I just want to begin by saying how moving and interesting I found this movie to be, and also how I think, because we're in such a tumultuous moment, how resonant, these interesting resonances that it had for this period of instability that the world is in. And so I want to dig into all of that during our time together, but I want to begin with the question just of how you came to this project. I mean, Robert Fisk was and remains a legend, but how did this project come to you?
Yeah, it's not such a glorious story. I wish I had a really great, I was on the front lines of somewhere, but it really is basically, but there is a kind of a backstory to why I think I just kind of dove into wanting to make the film. And it's also based around just the timing of things. You know, in 2016, I was filming this sort of anthology documentary about the 2016 U.S. elections with Clinton and Trump, and I was sent to Vermont to cover the story of Boots Wardinsky, who was running for the Progressive Party, Bernie's old party, and he's an off-the-grid garlic farmer running for lieutenant governor of the Progressive Party, and so that's where I was in this beautiful off-the-grid farm. And at 9 p.m. that evening of the November 8th, 2016, Boots said, this election is done. I'm shutting the grid down. We're going to bed. Clinton has won it. I don't care about her. I don't care about Bernie. This is, Trump, this is done. And we went to bed. And we were, myself, my crew, we were just kind of like, yeah, this is done. And we went to sleep. We woke up the next morning, and obviously we know what happened. And I think there was a shock there that through all my crew and everyone I was, that entire time, it was quite jilting and confusing. And I related it to the fact that I wasn't really diving into the right kind of news and information that I should have been. And then I remembered, that there was a part of me when I was in university that was following ZNet, Z Magazine, and all the writers from Z Magazine, and all sorts of things was very prevalent for me to be reading this stuff and gaining a sense of the world. And then I don't know what happened. I kind of stepped away or got lost in other things, other things I wanted to focus on. And then I got a call from the Film Board, the National Film Board of Canada. It was Anita and Nelly Fabrizio, the producer, and Allyson that asked me to make a film about Robert Fisk, and it sort of collided together as a moment of like, oh yeah, this is the right time, and that was in 2016. So went to Beirut, met with him, spent a week, and it was quite intimidated. I'm familiar with his work, so I entered it quite quite nervous, but the charm, the beauty of Fisk is that he knows how to disengage that kind of air and make things very comfortable, and we got along really well.
It's interesting. You see that powerfully in the film, right? His ability to put people at ease,
Yeah.
right? Even if they're on the other side, even if there's someone who could be dangerous or a threat to him, but he has that
He has that.
amazing ability to connect, and you see that so vividly in your project. I wanted to ask you though, I mean, did you have trepidation? I mean, I make films about philosophers. I stay safe in their libraries and their
Yeah.
lecture halls. I mean, did you go a war correspondent? I mean, do I really want to do this?
Yeah,
Where will it
from
take me?
as I recall, when I last met you in person, maybe it's been more than just that one time, but I did, from miracle fruit, from the fruit hunters to war zones. It's quite a leap. Yeah, I'm not a war correspondent. I'm not a journalist. I think, and I was about to have a young daughter, so there were a lot of things, that were nerve-wracking. But I think the idea of being with Fisk was the reassurance that he's someone who had lived through so much, 40 plus years, covering these conflicts in the Middle East. And so there was something about that was reassuring, that he is someone, through my time with him, he's someone that doesn't get into trouble. He avoids it. I think he's built a sort of a sensibility to when things are not right, and will walk away and stay away from those situations. So I felt tethered to that. And there's a degree of risk for sure. And I think we as a team were very careful about how we were getting into things,
Can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, sort of where you went, were there places that you went that don't make it into the final cut, what the shooting process was like?
Yeah, I
In
mean,
a way, and because often when people do films, right, they have fixers, and instead you have Robert Fisk as this amazing guide and his fixers.
yeah, I mean, we had Fisk and his
Mhm.
fixers, and so you know what's so funny? The thing that didn't make it into the film was a sequence of investigations he did in Beirut that we cut. Not, I think, just because it was such a left field story for Fisk. He was covering but not really. It was a local environmental story he was covering about the theft of soil in the soil rich mountains of Lebanon, that were being kind of siphoned off and used for building luxury condominiums along the Corniche in Beirut City, and so we followed this kind of. It was a real detective kind of approach to investigation that Fisk took us on, where he would go from. We literally followed we basically chased a truck carrying all this soil and gravel to its destination, and along the way it went from that to the Mennonite church, and then not the Maronite church, and then and then it led to a vintner. It was a crazy tour, and it was Fisk at his most gleeful and Fisk at his most childlike, and I found that was common to his work, that it was always eye-opening for him, and he was oftentimes like a child, like a giddy kid, and so energetic, and just like a fervor of energy, and I think for that simple reason, it was so outside of the world that we were really covering with him, to Bosnia, to Syria, that this little sequence, although very demonstrative of his character, just didn't really fit the vibe of the whole film. So unfortunately we cut it, but we did put it up through the independent website, through Robert's column, that we did put that cut sequence. For those that are interested, you can go and look for it. But yeah, you know how it is. You film so much. You come in, and in particular, I think about this film, I was remarkably given the permission from the producers, in fact, encouraged not to worry about the story. And that was something I must confess from very, very early on. I was like, usually I kind of know where I'm going with it. And in this regard, knowing that it was going to be a film about journalism, a film about truth, whatever that is, and told through Robert's perspective, but kind of grappling with that other task of how to mold in the anything to deal with the Middle East and the history of the Middle East and how we were going to navigate that. And so it was sort of like, well, we can focus on journalism, but then, we can't really frame 40 years in 90 minutes or whatever it was. And so I think that was, it was helpful to get that encouragement. Just don't worry about it, just follow him. And then worked with a great editor, Mike Munn, who is the editor of many great movies like Picture of Light and Sarah Pauli's Stories We Tell. And Mike was Mike, like all editors, was like my rock, like the sort of the father figure. Like my other editors have been my the mothers, the surrogate mothers. He was like a surrogate father in this regard. And we edited for a year, and it was built in the editing room, the structure of the film, because we wanted it to organically weave from past to present, that was something that was so important, because it was aligned with the way Robert thinks and how he can leap from, he can make these connections through history to the present day, to the future. That was Robert's great ability as a journalist.
Yeah, that really brings me to what I was thinking when I was watching it. When you read biographies of people, there's a genre called, an intellectual biography, where you get their ideas and the history of the ideas in there.
Yeah.
And your film has to, brilliantly weaves these threads, but very non-didactically, just through his life. And you bring his concept, his rich understanding of history. He's got a 40-decade career, and you get this longer view through his stories from his father and all of that. You realize what a historian he is. And so that it makes sense for the viewer, you have to just give enough context for these conflicts. So you also have to summarize these incredibly complicated aspects of international relations and these, long ongoing wars. So I can only imagine that was a major challenge. And then you did it with no narration, really, just his voice. So talk about those decisions, how you came up with the format in that year in the editing room.
I think it was that we required that year to figure it out, and that it was built so organically. Mike was sort of sifting through footage in tandem with our shoots, and we knew also that we had access to 3 essential archival pieces, movies or documentaries that Robert was either featured in or was a part of through the decades. And one of them being the BBC documentary about Robert covering the Troubles, the quote unquote Troubles in Northern Ireland. And the other, a documentary about the Times of London in the mid 80s. And then in the early 90s, a 3-part series he made for Channel 4 called From Beirut to Bosnia. And then through those sources, you could, we knew we had him kind of aging and, in places. And there was like kind of an active archive of him at work, which was great. So the challenge was how to bounce from that to the present day. At one point in the filmmaking process, it was sort of like, oh, I could throw a question at him in the car ride, and he could in a car ride, he could reference, he could reference a moment in history, and then we could cut to that moment in the archive. But it never worked out that way because you couldn't put words in, you couldn't feed things to Robert. That wasn't the intention. That was not the approach of the filmmaking approach. It was just out of whatever we could muscle together out of the film with the archive, with what he was giving us through the interview as well. So there was the present day footage investigating. There was a very long interview, 2-day interviews. I think we have 16 hours of interviews with Robert that was the basis of the voiceover that you hear through the film. And with all that information, we sort of linked it together, and it was really muscled together. I mean, I can't even describe how it happened because it was extremely organic. I think it is because, as you mentioned, the didactic tone is not there because we just kind of flowed from idea to idea. It was almost a stream of consciousness. Like, it was actually almost sort of like Robert, we laid out a bed of dialogue, and it was sort of like, well, this about Sabratilla massacre, is about reporting and on the side of those who suffer. And then slowly, sort of carving that into the next theme and the next theme. And it kept kind of rolling like that. I can't describe how it worked. Mm-hmm. It was almost like so tightly, it was like a puzzle that we, really fit together, and a jigsaw puzzle. And if we removed one element, as we were doing when we were moving the structure around, everything would kind of tumble or it wouldn't hold together. It was that kind of film. I don't know. Have you ever experienced that?
I like the stream of consciousness, but it's Robert's consciousness, right? And he's a very focused person. And
yeah.
There's these nice moments too where you capture, convey that he has these epiphanies or these periods of sort of pivotal disillusionment, right? Where he realizes he has to stand up not just, for those who suffer, but against his editors and the establishment, right? Yeah. And it's very, in that sense, you also get to experience a kind of growth that he undergoes as a human being to become who he is at the end. And that's a nice element.
Yeah, and I think, part of that, and I credit Anita for kind of helping us shape that, was sort of seeing the movie also as a character arc, and to see how Robert had, shifted his point of view from the idealistic young journalist in the 1970s to the jaded and very angry, journalist who ends up, at the end of the movie, kind of there's someone who is beaten, I don't know. There's a sort of a taste of sadness there, a bitterness, that we then, I think, but isn't really what permeates what Robert is, what he hopes, and what I guess now what he's tried to leave for us. But I think it was unavoidable in that way too, because he would address it directly. He was very sad at the state of journalism, especially, now, which is, I think, extremely frustrating for him. Someone who is, I guess, I don't know how to say it, like kind of more old school in that way, which was, not 24/7 Twitter person. He was not that person at all. And so I think that was very, very aggravating for him. As you know, it must have been for anyone who's weathered in that way of research and investigation and reporting. It's weird to be in a world where you just can't figure out or navigate what is the truth. And I think that also was overwhelming for me. And I'm still kind of trying to figure that out, because I do go to social media and Twitter for the immediate dopamine fix of what's happening in the world. But I know that we need to go to other places, and obviously like The Intercept, which I think you have affiliation with, and Democracy Now! And places like this, which I go to read, what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, that element of it is so interesting, because he's one of the recurring themes in the film is that he's both a reporter, an investigative reporter, a journalist of conflict, and a columnist, someone who doesn't pretend there are both sides, that both sides are equally valid, right? If one side is propaganda, one side is demonstrably false. Yeah. And that I think that sense that, truth and facts doesn't also have a positionality, right?
That's right.
Is a powerful theme of his work and the film. And it really speaks, again, not didactically, but is evocative of the crisis we're in, the crisis of truth and the crisis of journalism. And so I was wondering, if this experience just shifted your thoughts. I mean, you kind of just got to that, but that was one of the things.
Yeah.
you know,
Oh, I was hoping for that.
mhm.
As the filmmaker making the film about journalism about Robert Fisk, I was hoping for that aha moment, that, that release where it's like, oh, this is how it's done. And part of it, I did learn so much just through, I think, what got me, what I really connected to through Robert Fisk was this notion of his moral integrity, I would say, this notion of the integrity of the journalist. Early in the research phase, it was like, oh, if you Google his name, many, many things will come up about Robert Fisk, right? He definitely is not as celebrated in that way amongst his peers. And I came in with that kind of feeling too, like I got to suss that out. I got to figure out what that is, because he could be taking me for a bit of a ride. And so I was of that mind in the beginning. And then slowly over the couple of years that I gotten to know him, we had instances where it was sort of like, where I would ask him something or push him into something, and his integrity would stand out and stand up. And I realized, like, oh, he's a guy that he's of that ilk, which is, he says what he says, he writes what he writes, because he knows his truth to be true and his integrity to be unshakable. Do you know what I mean? And so that's why he doesn't lend an ear to the trolls and to critics and try to play into those things. He just turns away from that, because he knows his integrity will stand that test of time. I think you see it in the film with, for example, the 2018 Douma gas attack in Syria. We know now that he was right. I guess that's what I learned, that as a journalist, you need to be rock solid with your ethics and your morals, and you can't waver. The minute you waver or give in, you become questionable. And I think that is something that Robert never played into.
Mhm.
Maybe that's what I got out of that experience. But other than that, in terms of journalism and truth, I don't know if I've come much further. I still think I'm trying to understand what it is.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And
Yeah.
the film ends on an ambiguous note, as you hinted at, but I want to get back to that. So he
Okay.
says something, he talks about, as he's writing, that he tries to write for a friend, right? He tries
Mhm.
to communicate to his readers in a way that brings them along. And I was just wondering, who were you directing for, right? When you were thinking of that,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
voice of the film, the story arc, all of this.
Well, I think for me, it's for this particular film, I am definitely not I was not the expert, and I never really am, but past films that I've made, they've been about China. So I felt like I had a little closer contact with the culture and such. But in this movie, it was very removed. I was the Chinese Canadian going into the Middle East, and with the British journalists. It was like, there's so many layers that it was kind of uprooting for me. And although I found, in some ways, as an aside, similarities just in culturally between the Middle East and Chinese culture, just the way some things are done, certainly in those kind of countries where it's authoritarian governments and such, there's a way, something that permeates down to the everyday person too, and the way you operate in those worlds. And I found that was slightly familiar. But to get back to it, I think that I think that it was really, I think I'm losing my train of thought. Can you jump back to your question?
Yeah.
I was like, I'm trying to follow something.
I said that he has this thing where he's trying to write for a friend.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And
Oh, yes,
so,
of course, yeah. Yeah, I mean, my film. So my point was that I think I was coming in as usually I think of the audience, right? I think of like,
Mhm.
okay, this film is for, um, you know, for such and such group, or usually people say, oh, I want everyone to watch the film. But I think as we were carving this movie, it was certainly for, I think people that were kind of had a feeling for the Middle East, an understanding of Middle East politics, and but wanted to kind of dig into it through a point of view like Robert Fisk, like someone would through Chomsky or something like this.
Mhm.
And I think Chomsky's manufacturing consent was a reference for me and the approach to this film. Um, uh, I wanted it to be more about also ideas, not necessarily driven by the what would you call it? Like the biography of Robert Fisk, the ins and outs of his everyday life, like it wasn't following that thread. It was definitely more about, and if we tried to, you would just it wouldn't make sense, because what you wanted to get to was the meat of his thoughts, and that voiceover, that stream of consciousness. So um I guess the audience in the end was oddly kind of no one's ever asked me this before, and I think I'm answering this for the first time, but I really think it was for myself,
Mhm.
in a way, because I am that person who wants to glean something. I'm, trying to seek knowledge through Robert about journalism, about truth, and trying to navigate as if sitting with him for 16 hours and having him talk to me. I think that was sort of the intention to get through in the film. um, and so yeah,
No, I think that really works because it's incredibly
yeah,
daunting, right? These are
it
incredibly
was
complicated
incredibly daunting.
issues. What
Incredibly.
I want to talk about the title, so I've got two questions.
Yeah.
Um, this is not a movie. I interpreted that off the bat as someone saying, this isn't a movie, this is war, it's
Mm,
life and death.
mm,
It
mm,
actually is something so much more heartbreaking by the end when
mm.
he says it, because you use the word bitterness. I didn't take it as bitter.
Oh, good.
A
Okay.
kind of realism, and this I think it's more me as an activist speaking than
Yeah.
as a filmmaker, but
Yeah.
it's that you work so hard for justice, and you know you might not even hold the line. Things might still get worse,
Yeah.
and yet you have to keep going on this. And that
Love
I
that.
so appreciated that almost anti-heroism.
Yeah.
um and when he says this is not a movie, he's saying there's not a guaranteed happy ending. That's what I
That's it.
heard. But
Yeah.
I quite I was very moved by that. And to me, if there was a takeaway or message of the film, was that perseverance,
Yeah.
um, without a guarantee of peace or progress.
I
But
love
I
that.
love the title. I loved it before I understood it, but I'm curious about how titles are hard. I'm just curious about what it means to you and what how you
Yeah,
settled
yeah.
on it.
When we tried to figure out another title, for example, like that one came in pretty early on. It stuck, and it was it relates to Robert's. I think we quote it directly in the film when he talks about, uh, as you mentioned. I mean, uh, this is real life. This is not a movie. But I like your note about from the activist position. I do think I say bitterness, but I also say it because in the film we end on the note where there is a tinge of hopefulness there, and for me it's that moment when Robert says, the least we can do is to keep a record of the event, right, so that nobody can question whether or not something did or did not happen. And that to me is sort of the point. I really like that point. I love that he said that. And the film to me is, this is not a movie. This is this is real life. This is not a movie. It's, as you said, it's not like it's not the Hollywood ending. It's not the perfect Hollywood film. It's not Foreign Correspondent, the Hitchcock film that he loves so much. And so lamentation. How do you pronounce that word? I don't even know. But it is sort of like this thought that I think we wanted to leave a note on. And it's that kind of, I don't know. I'm glad you like the title, because I'm not sure everyone, it takes a while to figure it out, I think, for some
Mhm.
people. Certainly if you don't know Robert Fisk, it's sort of like, and I'm aware that there is a, This Is Not a Film, the other movie by the Iranian filmmaker. But I felt like a movie is different than a film. So that was the other reason why.
Yeah, it's poignant is the word I would say. It's a poignant note that it ends on. So my last question is just, how do you see this in your body of work? Because you have made very different films. You haven't made a sort of biography of the important figure. I mean, some people specialize in these.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, how does it fit in your,
It's so
amazing
funny.
body of work, and where are you going next? What's up? What's
I
out
mean,
there?
I am not fluid in that way. I go where I guess I'm quite curious in that way, and I like to learn about things. So I dive into really weird subject matter, like my film about exotic fruit, and then I made a film about boxing, and now I'm in this is the biography about Robert Fisk, so to speak, the journalist. So I think I'm more driven by the character. I don't know where I'm going next. I mean, I'm working on a film about hockey in China. More look at geopolitics behind sports and capitalism, I think, is how I would look at that. Um, uh, I've got so many things I want to work on, as do you. I think you certainly have covered a lot of ground too, right? In terms
The
of
world's an interesting place. So
yeah, exactly.
it'll break your
Exactly.
heart, but it's interesting.
I mean, I do think basically to answer the question, I want to go back to China. I think there's plenty of things going on there. And it's certainly a place now where you have to, unfortunately, kind of tread quite carefully in terms of trying to make something that you want to make versus, compromising that. So I'm navigating that right now.
The last thing I think people might be curious, you did get to premiere the film before Robert passed away. Did he give you any feedback, or, what was that last?
Yeah, he did. So he was hands off. I had editorial control. And then towards the end, he came to the screening at the world premiere at TIFF. And he unfortunately he did reveal that he had to watch a little bit of it because he was being interviewed by the Globe and Mail and he had to know just a little bit what it was about. So he watched a bit of it, and he was not happy. He felt like, oh my gosh, this is like the audience listening to me waffle and waffle on, is what he said. And then after the world premiere, it was definitely a different vibe, and he stood up and he came up to the front. There was a standing ovation. I could see a glimmer of emotion in his eyes, and there were Palestinians in the audience who I'll never forget erupted in applause after the Sabra Shatia massacre, where Robert was just talking about the wrong, and so angry. And that was a moment, let me tell you, for the audience. It was electrifying to be there for that. So yeah, Robert, in the end, I think he just really was appreciative of the film. I wonder if also there was a kind of a note of, seeing yourself on the big screen and looking back at all that history, which of course I couldn't even scratch the surface of in terms of everything that he's covered, every story he broke, the books he's written, the book that he was writing, and I think almost finished, and I'm hoping it will come out and be published soon. Night of Power, it's called. Yeah, he was happy, I think.
It's a beautiful note to end on. So congratulations on your great work, my friend, and I'm excited for what you do next.
Thanks, Astra. Thanks so much.